Hello! Welcome back to the UiPath Production Ready Essentials training. In this tutorial, we're going to learn more about the state machine, when it's best to use this layout, and how to set states, conditions, and transitions within it. We're going to automate a payments process in which input from the user and predefined conditions determine the transition between several states. As you will see, our process is a bit more complex, and we need a layout that allows us to easily define transitions between states without using a lot of loops and if statements. Given all the requirements, the basis of our workflow will be a state machine layout. So, what will our workflow do? It will ask the users for their initial balance, then prompt them to add the value of the amount that they want to pay. Then, depending on several predefined conditions, either prompt them to make a new payment or display a message informing them that the process is finished. Let's get going. We start the project as a sequence, and then we add a state machine from the Activities panel. To get the initial balance from the user, we add our first state. By linking it to start, it becomes the initial state of the process. We'll rename it getInitialBalance and add an annotation to document what we're trying to do. Get initial balance of the account. We double-click to open it. We notice that a simple state has 3 editable sections. The entry section holds the activities that will be performed when the state is entered. The exit section holds the activities that will be performed when exiting the state. And the transitions section describes the current transitions this state has in relation to other states. So, what we want to achieve in the initial state of our process is to ask for the initial balance from the user. For that, we'll use an input dialog activity in the entry area and prompt the user to insert a number. We'll then need to store the output of the activity in a string variable called input value. Make sure to set a global scope, in this case state machine, for all the variables that you use throughout this workflow. Now we need to make sure that the input provided by the user is valid. In our case, the input should be a double, a number holding maximum 16 digits. To perform this conversion, we use an if activity and the double.tryPass method, which returns a Boolean value, true if the conversion was successful, and a false value if the conversion failed. Then we'll create a new variable called currentBalance and set its type to double. If the input value variable can be passed with the before-mentioned method, it is in the currentBalance variable where we assign its value by using a double.pass method. If the input value cannot be passed, we will then notify the user that the input is not valid by using a message box activity in the else area. We also create a new Boolean variable for storing data about the fact that the user input is not valid. We'll call it isValidInput, and we'll set the default value to true. We'll then use an assign activity under the message box to assign the value false to isValidInput. From this point, the execution can take 2 different directions. If the input is not valid, the user should be prompted to close the payment process. This means that the process will transition to its final state, and therefore, the execution of the process will stop. We'll create the final state later on, but now let's see what is the second direction the execution can take. If the input is valid, the user will be prompted to input the value of their payment. This means that the process will transition to the getPaymentValue state. So, let's go back to the state machine view and create this next state. The easiest way is to copy and paste the getInitialBalance state, then rename it to getPaymentValue. We'll also add an annotation to document the purpose of this step. getPaymentValue for current iteration. Now let's double-click to open the state and rename the input dialog to PaymentValue. At this point, the user will input the amount that they want to pay, so we need to store that input in a new variable called payment value. We'll set its type to double and give it a global scope. In the copied assign activity, we now need to replace the current balance variable with the newly created one, payment value. So what we've just done helps us to cover both the scenarios in which the user adds a valid double value or an invalid one. Going back to the state machine view, we notice that our process does not have a final state yet. And when using a state machine, it is mandatory to have one. Let's go ahead and create it, then add it at the bottom of the workflow. We'll double-click to open the state. You can see that the structure of a final state is different from the one of a simple state. The only area available is the entry area, which holds the activities that are performed when the state is entered. As the name implies, this is the last state that the process can be in, and therefore we cannot define any transition from a final state to any other state. Now let's go back to our example. When the users get to this point, we want to notify them that the process is finished. We'll do so by using a message box activity in the entry area of our final state. So, we now have an initial state, a simple state, and a final state. It's time to add our first transitions. Up to this point, the user will input their initial balance, and next, they'll then be prompted to input their payment value. That can only be triggered if we create a transition between the getInitialBalance state and the getPaymentValue state. Now we do that by simply adding a line between the two. Then we double-click to open the transition and rename it to ValidInput. So, if we remember, the condition for the process to move from the initial state, getInitialBalance, to the payment-value state is to have a valid input from the user. So we set the condition that the transition should only be triggered if the isValidInput variable is true. For the scenario in which the input from the user is not valid during the initial state, getInitialBalance, we'll create a transition from the getInitialBalance state to the final state. And we'll set the condition that the transition should be triggered if the input is not valid. And we've now added all the transitions starting from the initial state, getInitialBalance. After exiting this state, the user will either be prompted to add their payment amount, or if their input is not valid, they'll be prompted to finish the process. But if the user transitions to the state of adding their payment amount, there are 3 possible transitions to the next states. If they add an invalid payment input, the process will stop, and we transition to the final state. We already have a transition in place for that. If they add a valid payment input, but they don't have enough balance to pay the amount, their payment will be denied. For that, we'll need to create a new state and a new transition. If they add a valid payment input and they have enough balance to pay the amount, their payment will be made. For that also, we'll need to create a new state and a new transition. In the case of payment denial, we want to let the user know that the transaction could not be performed due to insufficient funds. We'll also want to display their current balance and ask them if they want to continue with another transaction. So, how do we do that? We add a new state, rename it Deny Payment, and add an annotation stating what the purpose of the state is. Display message about payment denial. We then open the state and add a message box activity in the entry field to notify the user that the payment could not be processed due to insufficient funds. We continue typing an expression in the message box that returns the current balance to the user. And we finish up by asking the user if they want to continue. We then close the message box and set its option to yes/no to get input from the user regarding what they want to do next. And we'll store this input in a new string variable called continueAnswer. If the user has enough balance to pay the amount, we want a state in which we will subtract the payment value from the current balance. Then we'll let the user know that the transaction was processed, display the value of the current balance, and ask them if they want to continue. The easiest way is to duplicate the deny payment state. Rename it Make Payment and add an annotation stating what the purpose of the state is. Display message about payment and new balance. We then use a message box in the entry field to notify the user that the payment was processed successfully. We now need to subtract the payment value from the current balance. For that, we add an assign activity above the message box and rename it Reassign Current Balance. We then type the method for subtracting the payment value from the current balance. Now, we have states in place to cover all possible scenarios. We just need to add the remaining transitions. So, if the user's payment input was valid, but they don't have enough balance to pay the amount, their payment will be denied. Thus, the process will transition from Get Payment Value state to Deny Payment state. Let's add this transition. Open it, then name it Insufficient Funds, and make sure that we set the right condition. If the user's payment input was valid and they have enough balance to pay the amount, their payment will be made, and thus the process will transition from Get Payment Value state to Make Payment state. Let's add this transition. Open it, then name it Sufficient Funds, and make sure that we set the right condition. Now let's make sure that we have set all transitions correctly from the Get Payment Value state. Great! Everything seems in place. Please note that it's recommended to define transitions in a way that only one transition at a time is true, as we did in our example. We set that by adding a condition in the Deny Payment and Make Payment states to only trigger the transitions if we have valid input from the user. However, you should know that if there are more transitions active at the same time, only the first one defined will be executed. So, let's go back to our process. Now we only need to make sure that we have all the transitions in place for Deny Payment and Make Payment states. Now there are two possible transitions from each. When prompted to continue, the user can respond with yes or no. Let's start with the scenario in which the user does not want to continue and selects no. We'll start with Deny Payment state. In this case, the workflow transitions from the Deny Payment state to the final state. Let's create the transition, rename it to Stop, and set the condition. Then we'll continue with the Make Payment state. The workflow transitions from the Make Payment state to the final state. Let's create this transition, rename it to Stop, and set the condition. Now let's cover the scenario in which the user wants to continue and selects yes. We'll start with Deny Payment. If the user selects yes, then they'll be sent back to adding a payment value. So, in our workflow, a transition is triggered from Deny Payment state to Get Payment Value state. Let's create the transition, rename it to Continue, and set the condition. And we'll continue with Make Payment. If the user selects yes, the same happens. They'll be sent back to adding a payment value. So, in our workflow, a transition is triggered from Make Payment state to Get Payment Value state. Let's create the transition, rename it to Continue, and set the condition. And with that, all of our states and transitions are now defined. We check one last time if all the possible scenarios are covered. Yep, everything seems in place. We can now run our workflow. As you can see, we are prompted to add our current balance. The input provided is valid. How do we know that? Well, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to add the value of the payment. Then the payment amount was subtracted from the original balance and the new balance is displayed. we now have the option of continuing with the process. Once we select Yes, we are asked to make a new payment. We add the value of the new payment and then the new balance is again displayed. Once we select No, the message box notifies us that the process is finished. And that was the final state of our process. And that concludes our lesson on state machines. Thank you for watching.